On July 17, 2019, inside a packed federal courtroom in Brooklyn, New York, one of the most infamous criminals of our time heard his fate. Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, once the untouchable boss of the Sinaloa Cartel, was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in a U.S. prison, plus an extra 30 years, and ordered to forfeit an astonishing $12.6 billion. This wasn't just a punishment, it was a message. The judge made it clear that the scale of Guzmán's crimes, the violence his empire unleashed, and the sheer audacity of his operations demanded the harshest penalty the law could give. But here's the question. How do you actually lock away a man who has embarrassed governments, escaped the most secure prisons in Mexico, and controlled a drug empire that reached across continents? Over the next 25 minutes, we'll uncover the global manhunt, the mountain of evidence that crushed his defense, the legal battles that followed, and where El Chapo is right now, inside America's most secure prison. So, who is El Chapo and why he mattered? Joaquín Archibaldo Guzmán Loera was born in a rural mountain village in Sinaloa, Mexico in 1957. His childhood was marked by poverty, limited education, and the harsh reality of a region where the drug trade wasn't just common, it was often seen as one of the only ways out. By the late 1970s, Guzmán had found his way into the business, working under powerful traffickers and learning the routes, the contacts, and the ruthless tactics that would later define his own reign. He earned the nickname El Chapo, meaning shorty because of his small stature, but his influence was anything but small. Rising to lead the Sinaloa Cartel, he turned it into one of the largest and most profitable criminal organizations in history, trafficking billions of dollars worth of cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and marijuana into the United States and beyond. What made him different was his adaptability. He forged alliances, bribed officials, and used elaborate smuggling methods, from tunnels under the US-Mexico border to hidden compartments in cargo. For decades, he outmaneuvered rivals and authorities alike, becoming a figure both feared and mythologized. But for US prosecutors, his capture and conviction weren't just about stopping one man. They were about dismantling the system that kept him untouchable, the cat-and-mouse years in Mexico. By the early 2000s, El Chapo had already become a ghost for law enforcement, always one step ahead, always surrounded by layers of protection. After a 13-year run on the outside, Mexican authorities finally captured him in February 2014 at a beachfront condominium in Mazatlan. It was a major win for the government, but victory didn't last long. In July 2015, Guzmán pulled off one of the most daring prison breaks in history. From a maximum security facility, he vanished through a mile-long tunnel dug directly into his cell's shower area. The tunnel had lighting, ventilation, and even a modified motorcycle on rails, proof of meticulous planning and deep corruption. The escape humiliated the Mexican government and reignited his legend as an untouchable escape artist. For months, he moved through safe houses, protected by loyal gunmen. But in January 2016, his luck ran out. A raid in the city of Los Mochis turned into a violent gun battle. Guzmán fled through drainage tunnels, but was caught after stealing a vehicle in a desperate escape attempt. This time, officials knew the US would demand custody, and they wouldn't risk losing him again. The handoff, extradited to the United States. On January 19, 2017, after months of legal maneuvering, heightened security, and behind-the-scenes negotiations, Joaquín Guzmán was handed over to U.S. authorities. This was no ordinary prisoner transfer. Mexican officials coordinated a heavily guarded operation involving armed convoys, military escorts, and strict secrecy to prevent any possibility of rescue or interference. By the time news of his extradition broke, El Chapo was already en route to New York aboard a U.S. government aircraft. Why New York? Federal prosecutors in the Eastern District of New York had built one of the most comprehensive cases against him, uniting evidence from multiple states and countries. The indictment outlined decades of trafficking, murders, kidnappings, and bribery, backed by testimony from former cartel members and mountains of seized records. This venue also offered something Mexico couldn't guarantee: a trial under maximum security in a judicial system with no tolerance for escapes. When he landed at MacArthur Airport in Long Island, federal agents immediately took custody. He was whisked to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, held under the strictest conditions available. The United States now had its most wanted drug lord, and this time, there would be no tunnels, no bribes, and no second chances. Building the case, what prosecutors had. When Joaquín Guzmán stepped into a U.S. courtroom for the first time, he wasn't facing a single isolated charge. He was staring down a sweeping 12-count indictment built over years of international investigation. At the center was the continuing criminal enterprise statute, sometimes called the kingpin charge, which is reserved for leaders of vast, organized narcotics operations. To secure a conviction, prosecutors needed to show that Guzmán wasn't just involved in drug trafficking. He was orchestrating it on a massive scale, managing networks of people, money, and weapons that stretched across borders. The government's evidence came from a tapestry of sources gathered in cooperation with law enforcement agencies in Mexico, the United States, and multiple other countries. Investigators had tracked the movement of drugs from South American suppliers through Central America and Mexico, all the way into U.S. cities. They showed records of multi-ton shipments hidden in shipping containers, concealed in produce trucks, and funneled through elaborate cross-border tunnels. These weren't just a few loads. They were consistent, high-volume deliveries capable of flooding entire regions with narcotics. One of the prosecution's most powerful tools was intercepted communications. Special operations teams had cracked encrypted devices used by cartel leaders, revealing messages that prosecutors said came directly from Guzmán. These exchanges included logistical instructions for moving shipments, discussions of payments to corrupt officials, and, at times, orders for violent action against rivals or suspected traitors. The ability to link his voice or his words to specific operations was a breakthrough in proving his personal command over cartel activities. Then there was the financial side. Prosecutors detailed how billions in drug profits were laundered through a complex web of front companies, real estate deals, shell corporations, and cash smuggling operations. They described couriers carrying suitcases stuffed with US dollars back into Mexico, money changing hands to protect trafficking routes, and investments in legitimate businesses to hide illicit gains. This financial evidence not only illustrated the scale of his empire, but also tied him directly to the profits of the drug trade. Perhaps the most dramatic component of the case was the witness testimony. More than a dozen cooperating witnesses, many of them former top cartel members or close associates, took the stand. They recounted personal experiences of meeting with Guzmán, receiving his orders, or watching him make high-level decisions. Their stories covered everything from international cocaine deals to chilling accounts of violence used to maintain control. Some described bribes to law enforcement and politicians so large that they seemed more like corporate budgets than criminal payouts. To strengthen these accounts, prosecutors presented physical evidence, ledgers seized from cartel stash houses, photographs, maps of smuggling routes, and even samples of the drugs seized in operations linked to his network. Each piece was designed to corroborate the others, creating a chain of proof that, when viewed together, left little room for doubt. By the time the government rested its case, jurors had seen an interconnected world of narcotics trafficking that operated like a multinational corporation, except this one relied on fear, corruption, and violence to function. And at the very top of that hierarchy, prosecutors argued, sat Joaquín Guzmán Loera, the man known as El Chapo. Inside the Brooklyn trial, October 2018, February 2019. When jury selection began in October 2018, the trial of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán was already being called the trial of the century by many in the media. Security in and around the Eastern District of New York courthouse was extraordinary. Every morning, heavily armed U.S. Marshals escorted Guzmán from the high-security Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, across the Brooklyn Bridge to the courthouse. The bridge was partially closed for these transfers, an unusual measure that demonstrated just how seriously authorities took the risk of any escape attempt or outside threat. Inside the courtroom, the jurors' identities were kept secret, and they were escorted by security at all times. Even in such a controlled environment, the tension was palpable. Reporters filled every available seat in the press area, while additional viewing rooms were set up to handle overflow interest. The trial was presided over by Judge Brian Cogan, who managed strict rules for courtroom conduct and evidence presentation to maintain order in a case with such high stakes. From the outset, Prosecutors made it clear they intended to dismantle any lingering myths about El Chapo's invincibility. They promised to show the jury how Guzmán's leadership of the Sinaloa Cartel resulted in the smuggling of over 200 tons of cocaine into the United States, along with massive quantities of heroin, methamphetamine, and marijuana. They emphasized that the case was not built on rumor or legend, but on hard evidence collected over decades. Over nearly 3 months, 56 witnesses took the stand. 14 of them were cooperating witnesses, former high-ranking members of the cartel or allied criminal groups. These insiders gave first-hand accounts of meetings where Guzmán planned shipments, approved assassinations, or negotiated bribes with government officials. One witness described a single bribe worth millions of dollars to ensure the safe passage of a major cocaine load. Another detailed the use of secret compartments in freight containers, passenger buses, and even private jets to move narcotics north. Prosecutors also introduced an extensive library of communications. These included intercepted phone calls, texts, and encrypted BlackBerry messages linked to Guzmán through forensic analysis. Some messages revealed coded language for drug quantities and payments, while others contained direct orders for violent retaliation against rivals. Jurors listened to recordings where cartel members discussed logistics down to the smallest detail: timing, routes, and payment schedules, all with Guzmán as the approving authority. The government's case was reinforced by physical evidence: ledgers recovered from safe houses, maps of drug routes, photographs of seized shipments, and videos showing the packaging process. In one striking exhibit, the jury saw images of custom-built submarines used to move cocaine along maritime routes, a sign of the cartel's ingenuity and vast resources. These visuals, paired with testimony, gave jurors a concrete sense of the cartel's scale. The defense strategy was to attack the credibility of the cooperating witnesses, many of whom were themselves convicted criminals hoping for reduced sentences. Defense attorneys argued that these witnesses had every incentive to exaggerate or even fabricate their stories. They also claimed that Guzmán was being unfairly portrayed as the singular mastermind, suggesting that other cartel figures, particularly Ismael El Mayo Zambada, were just as powerful, if not more so. However, the prosecution countered by highlighting the consistency between different witnesses' accounts and how they matched documentary and electronic evidence. Jurors weren't asked to believe any one person's word alone. Instead, they were shown how independent pieces of evidence fit together to form a unified narrative. By the time closing arguments were delivered in early February 2019, the jury had been exposed to a mountain of corroborated details about the inner workings of the Sinaloa Cartel and Guzmán's central role. Deliberations lasted just 6 days. On February 12, 2019, the jurors returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty on all 10 criminal counts he faced, including the continuing criminal enterprise charge. It was a decisive end to one of the most closely watched trials in U.S. criminal history, and it guaranteed that Guzmán's future would be determined not by his own cunning, but by the sentence of a federal judge. Sentencing day: life, 30 years, and the money judgment. On the morning of July 17, 2019, the federal courthouse in Brooklyn was surrounded by the kind of security presence normally reserved for heads of state. Streets were blocked, heavily armed officers patrolled the perimeter, and spectators lined up for hours, hoping to get one of the few seats in the gallery. Inside, Joaquín Guzmán sat in a dark suit, listening through a headset, as Judge Brian Cogan prepared to deliver his sentence. The courtroom was filled with lawyers, journalists, law enforcement officials, and a handful of victims' representatives. When Judge Cogan spoke, he made it clear this was no ordinary sentencing. He recounted the staggering scale of Guzmán's drug empire, the hundreds of tons of narcotics smuggled into the United States, the murders carried out to protect those operations, and the corruption that undermined institutions on both sides of the border. The judge said the harm caused by Guzmán's cartel was overwhelming, and that the law required the most severe penalty available. The sentence was delivered in measured, deliberate tones: life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 30 additional years for weapons-related charges. Along with the prison term, Cogan ordered Guzmán to forfeit $12.60 billion, an amount calculated from estimates of the cartel's U.S. drug profits during his leadership. While it was unlikely the government could ever recover such a sum, the figure stood as a symbolic reminder of the magnitude of his crimes. Throughout the hearing, Guzmán showed little visible reaction. When given the chance to speak, he complained about the conditions of his pre-trial confinement, calling them inhumane, and accused the trial of being unfair. His words did nothing to alter the outcome. The sentence was final. For the prosecutors and agents who had pursued him for years, this was the moment they had worked toward: the removal of one of the world's most notorious drug traffickers from the playing field. For Guzmán, it marked the end of decades spent evading capture, escaping prison, and running an empire that once seemed untouchable. He would leave the courthouse that day not as a feared kingpin, but as a federal inmate destined for the most secure prison in the United States. Where is he now? ADX Florence Supermax. After his sentencing, Guzmán's destination was kept under tight secrecy for security reasons. Within weeks, he was quietly transferred from New York to the United States Penitentiary. It is an administrative maximum facility in Florence, Colorado, better known as ADX Florence. Often called the Alcatraz of the Rockies, it is the most secure federal prison in the country, designed to hold the most dangerous and high-risk inmates in near-complete isolation. ADX Florence houses a small population of prisoners, many of whom are considered escape risks, terrorist leaders, or violent organized crime figures. Guzmán joined a roster that has included names like Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, 9/11's conspirator Zacarias Moussaoui, and cartel leaders from other major drug networks. His prisoner number, publicly listed by the Bureau of Prisons, marks him as one among only a few hundred inmates in a facility built to ensure no one can slip away. Life at ADX is a stark contrast to the power and mobility Guzmán once enjoyed. Inmates spend about 23 hours a day in their 7 by 12-foot cells, with one small window angled toward the sky to prevent any view of the horizon. Meals are eaten alone, and contact with other prisoners is almost non-existent. Communication with the outside world is strictly monitored, visits are rare, and phone calls are limited. Exercise consists of an hour in a small enclosed yard, often described as a concrete box. For Guzmán, the placement in ADX was a direct answer to the embarrassment his previous escapes caused for Mexican authorities. The prison's design and protocols make tunneling, bribery, or violent takeovers virtually impossible. Even movement inside the facility is tightly controlled. Doors, cameras, and motion sensors are integrated into every corner. Reports from legal filings and occasional interviews with his lawyers describe him as isolated and under constant observation, with little human interaction beyond corrections staff. At 66 years old, and with a life sentence plus 30 years, the possibility of him ever leaving ADX Florence alive is almost non-existent. The man who once commanded one of the largest criminal empires in history now lives in silence and solitude, locked away in a place specifically built for men like him, where the walls are as permanent as the sentence itself. The appeal. What he argued and what happened. Even after being locked away in the most secure prison in the country, Guzmán was not ready to accept his fate without a fight. In July 2020, his defense team filed a formal appeal with the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. The goal was to overturn his conviction or, at the very least, secure a new trial. The appeal raised a series of arguments aimed at casting doubt on the fairness of the proceedings that had led to his life sentence. One of the central claims was that members of the jury had allegedly violated the court's instructions by following media coverage during the trial. Defense lawyers cited an article in which an unnamed juror suggested that some panel members had been aware of headlines and social media reports about Guzmán while the case was ongoing. They argued that this outside exposure could have influenced the jury's decision-making and deprived their client of a truly impartial verdict. Another major point in the appeal concerned the extreme conditions of Guzmán's pre-trial confinement at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. The defense claimed those restrictions, virtually no human contact, constant surveillance, and limited access to legal counsel, made it impossible for him to prepare adequately for trial. They characterized the treatment as unnecessarily harsh and prejudicial. His lawyers also challenged aspects of the prosecution's case, arguing that the government's reliance on cooperating witnesses, many of them convicted criminals seeking reduced sentences, meant the evidence should be viewed with skepticism. They suggested that these witnesses had strong incentives to shift blame toward Guzmán and away from themselves. The prosecution countered each point, reminding the appellate judges that the trial court had taken significant precautions to protect jury impartiality, including anonymous jurors, security escorts, and repeated instructions to avoid all outside information. They emphasized that the evidence against Guzmán was overwhelming and consistent, drawn from multiple independent sources beyond witness testimony. On January 25, 2022, the Second Circuit issued its decision. The conviction and sentence would stand. The court rejected the claims about juror misconduct, noting that there was no concrete proof the jury had been improperly influenced. They also upheld the pretrial confinement measures, ruling that the restrictions were justified, given Guzmán's history of high-profile escapes and the risk he posed. Sue. With that ruling, his legal avenues narrowed considerably. While a petition to the U.S. Supreme Court remained technically possible, the High Court accepts only a tiny fraction of cases each year. For Guzmán, the appellate court's decision meant that the life sentence handed down in Brooklyn was not just a symbolic punishment. It was a legal reality from which there would be no escape. Aftershocks. Sinaloa Cartel without El Chapo. The removal of Joaquín Guzmán from the streets didn't bring the Sinaloa Cartel to a halt. It triggered a new phase in its evolution. While Guzmán was awaiting trial in the United States, the cartel's operations were already shifting under the control of other powerful figures. Foremost among them was Ismael El Mayo Zambada, a co-founder and longtime strategist of the organization. Zambada had famously avoided capture for decades, maintaining a lower profile while still directing major trafficking networks. So, alongside El Mayo came a new, younger leadership bloc, Los Chapitos, or the Little Chapos. These were Guzmán's sons, Ivan Archivaldo, Jesus Alfredo, Joaquín Jr., and Ovidio Guzmán Lopez. They inherited not only their father's networks and resources, but also his enemies and the constant pressure from law enforcement. The brothers were known for their brash style, using social media to flaunt their wealth and influence, a stark contrast to the more discreet methods of their predecessors. This generational shift led to tensions inside the cartel, especially as rival factions sought greater control of smuggling routes and territories. Violence spiked in certain regions of Mexico, with reports of high-profile gun battles and targeted assassinations, as the organization fought to maintain its dominance against both internal rivals and competing cartels like the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG. Law enforcement efforts didn't slow after El Chapo's conviction. In October 2019, Mexican security forces briefly captured Ovidio Guzmán in Culiacán, sparking an unprecedented armed response from cartel gunmen who laid siege to the city. Outgunned and fearing mass civilian casualties, the government released Ovidio, a move that was widely criticized but underscored the cartel's enduring power. That wasn't the end of Ovidio's story. In January 2023, he was recaptured in another major operation involving hundreds of soldiers and police. Later that year, he was extradited to the United States to face drug trafficking charges in federal court. His capture and extradition were touted by U.S. officials as another major blow to the Sinaloa Cartel, though experts pointed out that the organization's decentralized structure made it capable of adapting quickly to leadership losses. Today, the cartel remains one of the most influential criminal groups in the world. While Guzmán serves his life sentence under extreme isolation in Colorado, the enterprise he once led continues to operate, fueled by the same smuggling networks, corruption, and violence that allowed it to flourish in the first place. His downfall removed a legendary figurehead, but the machinery of the Sinaloa Cartel, built over decades, proved far bigger than one man. Did locking up El Chapo change the drug trade? When Guzmán was finally locked away for life, many wondered if it would mark a turning point in the international drug trade. After all, removing one of the most notorious traffickers in history seemed like it should send shockwaves through the criminal underworld. In reality, the picture is far more complex. Experts in organized crime point out that cartels like Sinaloa are not built around a single man. They operate more like multinational corporations, with layers of managers, logisticians, financiers, and enforcers who can step in when a leader falls. While Guzmán's capture disrupted some supply lines and caused temporary instability, the cartel's existing infrastructure quickly absorbed the shock. Shipments of narcotics into the United States continued, and street-level availability of drugs like methamphetamine and fentanyl showed little sign of slowing. This resilience is partly by design. Over the years, cartels have learned to avoid putting all their operations in one person's hands. They rely on compartmentalized cells that can function independently, making it harder for law enforcement to dismantle the entire network in one strike. Removing a kingpin might shift the balance of power or cause internal conflict, but it rarely collapses the organization entirely. The real change came in public perception and law enforcement strategy. Guzmán's case proved that even the most elusive figures could be brought to trial and held accountable under the U.S. justice system. It also highlighted the value of international cooperation, from intelligence sharing to coordinated arrests and extraditions. The successful prosecution became a model for future high-value target operations. Still, the demand for narcotics in consumer countries and the profitability of the trade mean new leaders are always ready to fill the vacuum. In some regions, the removal of one dominant figure has even led to more violence, as rival groups fight to claim territory. For the people living in areas affected by cartel activity, day-to-day life often changes little, regardless of who sits at the top. So, while locking up El Chapo was an undeniable victory for law enforcement, it was not the end of the drug war. His story serves as both an inspiration to investigators and a reminder of the scale of the challenge they face. The trade adapts, the players change, but the system endures, waiting for the next name to rise and, inevitably, to fall. Final takeaway. From the dusty hills of Sinaloa to a soundproof cell in the most secure prison in America, Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán's story is one of rise, reign, and relentless pursuit by law enforcement. For decades, he built an empire on fear, corruption, and a global narcotics network that funneled billions in drugs into the United States. He outmaneuvered rivals, bought loyalty, and twice escaped from maximum security prisons, embarrassing governments, and deepening his legend. But in the end, it wasn't a tunnel, a bribe, or a violent rescue that defined his final chapter. It was a courtroom. The U.S. case against him was airtight, built from years of investigation, miles of evidence, and testimony from those who had once stood at his side. The guilty verdict stripped away the myth, leaving only the man and the crimes he could no longer outrun. Today, Guzmán spends his life in near total isolation, far from the power he once wielded. His downfall is a reminder that even the most feared figures in organized crime can be brought down, but also a warning that the machine they built often survives long after they're gone.